to share my screen and then we'll get started. As Morgan said, we will do questions at the end because otherwise I lose my flow and then we don't get to cover all the stuff. So I want to make sure we kind of get all the information, but please, if you have any questions while I'm speaking, put them in the chat. If we don't get to your question by the end of the presentation, I will make sure you get an answer. We'll email you or something like that. Really excited to be presenting to you all tonight about bioremediation for urban gardens. We're going to be talking about how do we detoxify and regenerate soils for healthy food and medicine. So excited to get into it. If you want to put into the chat your name, if you want to introduce yourself, if there's any particular concern, if you're working on a garden or somewhere near you in terms of contamination and you want to kind of share about that, it helps me know kind of what contaminants that are of concern to you, and then we can make sure we talk about that a little bit more. So to get started, I like to define bioremediation, just so we're all kind of working from the same definition. So bioremediation, which is what we're talking about today, is allying with living organisms and systems to detoxify, repair, and regenerate contaminated soil and water. And this is done by either binding, extracting, or breaking down different contaminants. And these contaminants can be chemicals or heavy metals. And there's three main ways that we do that work. There's microbial remediation. And when I'm talking about microbial remediation, we're going to be talking a lot about working with bacteria. There's phytoremediation, where we work with different types of plants to, extract chemicals, to extract heavy metals, to do a whole bunch of different things. And then there's mycoremediation, which is where we work with fungi. And all the amazing things they do. The biggest thing I'm hoping we come out of tonight with is that every kind of, landscape, piece of land that we are working with, it's never one thing that's going to help with that regeneration and that detoxification. It's often working with several different tools in the remediation toolbox. You might not just be working with fungi, you might also work with bacteria and plants. It really depends on the contamination as well as the site that you're working on in terms of its conditions and the climate that you're in, and whether it's a lot of sun or shade, that all figures into this. So keep an open mind, and once we talk through all of these, you'll have a little bit more understanding of where you use what and when. Now, why do we care about bioremediation? For me, what got me into doing this work was I used to do urban farming and permaculture, and we know that a lot of our urban areas have contamination because of the ways that we've built our cities, the different building materials, what we used to allow in things like paints and gas and everything. As a result, we see a lot of heavy metals and contaminants in our soil. And if you're really stoked about growing food locally and gathering medicine and doing all that work, you want to make sure that the land is healthy so that the people can be healthy, and same with the water. And so from a place of food justice and food security, as well as environmental justice, there's a lot of neat things that bioremediation can offer. I think it also, the work that we do with kind of helping heal the land and restore its immune system and its ecology really lends itself also to climate resilience and giving it more strength to kind of go into these big disruptions that we're seeing. I also do a lot of work in disaster recovery, and the more we see wildfires, go through communities, or floods or hurricanes, we also see the movement of contaminants. And so we sometimes can use bioremediation in the aftermath of that. And I like often a cheaper alternative to what we call conventional remediation, which is you have contaminated land and you're going to, dig it up and kind of haul it away to a landfill, and you lose a lot of soil that way, and it costs a lot of money. And so a lot of bioremediation is really looking at how do we clean and heal and regenerate contaminated soil in place, on site, instead of moving it elsewhere, where it often becomes an environmental justice issue for another community. So really kind of trying to hold it more in a more justice way and a justice place. Now, before we talk about all the juicy fun stuff, we got to talk about contaminants, because that is what we're trying to detoxify and what we're trying to work with in the soil. When I usually have a bit longer to present, I go into every different contaminant and how you would find them and why you would find them on site. And just for the sake of time today, we're not going to do that, but I'm going to send around a resource after that kind of explains like why you might have certain heavy metals on a site, what you should look for when it comes to different chemicals. But just as a quick kind of summary, when we're looking at different contaminants, whether it's in the urban environment or rural, we usually kind of group those into three different buckets. We have our heavy metals, which are lead, cadmium, things like arsenic, chromium, copper, mercury, nickel, and there's others, but those are the very common ones that we will see in a lot of sites. The thing about heavy metals when it comes to remediation is heavy metals can't be broken down. So if anybody ever tells you that there's a mushroom that'll break down a heavy metal or a plant that'll break it down, that's not the case. With heavy metals, what we are often trying to do is find ways to extract them from the land and then dispose of them somewhere else. Or we are trying to find ways to immobilize them on site so that they can't move into plants and move into water and kind of move around. So we're trying to make them safer by binding them or by removing them altogether through extraction, because they cannot be broken down into something more benign. Chemicals, we have the ability with chemicals to break them down depending on what we're working with. And there's different types of chemicals. There's lots of different types of chemicals, but some of the common ones that we look at when we're looking at, again, different urban sites, in the aftermath of certain disasters, we look at something called PAHs, and that's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds. Those are things like benzene and toluene and xylene. We look at things like PCBs, which are really long-lasting chemicals. And also things like pesticides and insecticides, those also can really, really last for a long time in the environment. Dioxins and furans. Anytime you have something where people burn plastic, for example, if you have people who are burning their garbage on a site over the years, you'll see an accumulation of dioxin, right? And that's something that is, cancer causing and pretty gnarly. And then we have PFAS, which are the forever chemicals that are kind of a new awareness around that, and they are incredibly difficult to break down. So when it comes to bioremediation, breaking down things like PAHs, VOCs, dioxin, there's actually quite a lot of good research on that. PFAS is a bit of a harder one that folks are starting to turn their attention to. And then the third thing to consider with contaminants, and a little bit more friendly, is things like excess nutrients. And this is more of a situation where if you have, a lot of, waste coming off farms and manure and things like that, and fertilizers that are kind of making it into water bodies and causing algal blooms and over nutrification. Those are things that we can really address quite well with bioremediation. Things like nitrogen, there's excess nitrogen or phosphorus or E. coli. That's a pretty easy one to work with. So when we're going through everything, again, depending on what's on your site, you might have some of these, you might have all of these. It's easier when you only have one thing, but we often are dealing with a little bit of a toxic legacy, and there's usually more than one thing on site. So good to know what you're dealing with first. And then when it comes to this, I'll also add, we're not talking about this today, but the best way to know what's on your site is to do a soil test. Out because of past uses on site, like the site used to be a dry cleaner, or there used to be an auto body there, or there was a fire, right? Any of those things, you'll ask for different things in testing. And if you can't afford testing, because testing can be expensive, there are ways to, again, if you really know the site history and what happened on the land before, you can kind of look at that and then look at what chemicals and heavy metals might be there as a result. It's a bit of detective work. But that can also give you a bit of a general idea of what you need to be working with. Now, we're going to talk about microbial remediation, and then we're going to do phyto, and then move on to fungi before we kind of take questions. So starting with the microbes and the soil beneath our feet. When we're talking about working with microorganisms for remediation, they are really good when it comes to breaking down chemicals, especially hydrocarbons. There's a lot of really neat work that's happened using bacteria to break down oil, for example, or oil contaminated soil. They are also good at helping immobilize heavy metals, as well as building up clean, healthy soil. So especially if you have, heavy metal contamination, you need to really build up on your site. You can build a lot of clean, healthy soil if you know how to do microbial remediation. And it kind of has a dual purpose of both remediating and also, again, growing really clean, healthy soil that allows you to grow healthier, safer food It's really important to know about microbial remediation so that you can actually prepare your site for plants and phytoremediation. And it helps us restore the soil food web. So whenever we have major physical damage to landscape in terms of compaction, in terms of pesticides and chemicals and other fires, things like that, we have an issue with actually losing a lot of that beautiful microbial life that is in the soil. That is kind of the basis of kind of how we're able to have a beautiful, healthy soil that grows so much and sustains so much. And so there's a lot of work with microbial remediation where we're trying to restore those beneficial organisms and processes so that, you know, we can do more than just clean up the land, but actually sustain and nourish. So one of the main things when we're doing microbial remediation, that's just a picture of all the beings that are supposed to be in that healthy soil. We are really trying, when it comes to different bacteria and you know, fungi, we're really trying to get the biggest diversity we can into the soil at huge quantities, because different species of bacteria and other microorganisms have an affinity to different contaminants. Not all of them want to eat that gnarly dioxin or that gnarly oil that might be in the soil, but some of them might. So if you go for a big diversity and a big quantity, you're more likely to find that kind of, you know, the match between, you know, one or two species that actually want to do the dirty work. So we really want to kind of do different things that allow for big diversity and quantity of microorganisms in our soil. The warmer the temperature, the more quickly your remediation is going to go. A lot of the organisms that we work with in terms of bacteria, beneficial bacteria, are aerobic, which means they need oxygen. And that kind of comes into play a little bit later when we talk about your different tools. Another thing with microbial remediation is there's two types. There's something called bioaugmentation, and that's when we find different ways of bringing in tons and tons of beneficial bacteria onto a site that, you know, can break down our different chemicals. There's also something called biostimulation. It's where you actually find ways to make your site more hospitable and more livable for these microorganisms so that they can do their work. So that's like adding increased surface area and oxygen and different food sources for them. And that allows for more of that activity to happen. So just keep those in mind when you're doing your work. So we have different tools when it comes to microbial remediation. And it's actually one of the easier ones to get your head around, because if you are a gardener, you've already worked with some of these different tools when it comes to compost or actively aerated compost tea, you know, working with worm compost and things like that. But the difference is we're doing those very common garden things around compost, but we're doing a bit more. We're charging it up a little bit more and using a few little remediation add-ons to make it really potent. So one of the ways to actually bring in a lot of really beneficial microorganisms that could potentially break down different chemicals and really supercharge the soil is working with something called thermophilic compost. So that's a type of hot composting, which is very specific in terms of the types of bacteria and the diversity of bacteria and the communities of bacteria and microorganisms that it creates. And so it's important to, if you're going to try to really bring in lots of healthy compost onto your site, not every compost is created equal. So if you get some compost that, you know, it smells a little funny, it kind of was left too long, it never hit certain temperatures, you're going to have maybe a little bit of microorganisms in there, but not a lot. But if you do something called thermophilic composting, which is where you have the right mix of kind of different carbon, nitrogen, you know, ingredients, as well as you really monitor the temperature over a certain amount of time, you will end up with more of that kind of beneficial microorganisms that we really want to see on our site. So it allows us to inoculate the site in a big way with microorganisms. It also allows us to build clean, healthy soil. So if you have something like heavy metals, you're inoculating and you're kind of getting some of these organisms into the soil to, you know, do different work around immobilization or to break down different chemicals, but you're also covering up that kind of more toxic interface with the soil so that people and dogs and animals aren't engaging and kind of getting that contamination themselves. So it's helpful in that way as well. And we also know that often when people do things like bring in soil that they didn't kind of create themselves, it could have contaminants in it. If we're bringing in different, you know, soil and fill from different places, we don't know if it's clean or not. So learning how to build your own soil and build really microbial active soil is important. Another interesting thing is I have a few colleagues who have actually used thermophilic composting to break down oil contaminated soil. So you basically take soil that might be contaminated with certain chemicals and you run it through a hot composting process, as well as inoculating it and doing a few other things. And that allows for certain chemicals to be broken down. That's a bit more risky to do, but it is something that different folks are doing that's really interesting. Now, with stomatophilic composting, there are different things you can add to your compost that will give you more benefits when it comes to remediation. So one of the things I always say to folks is phosphorus. If you have any kind of way to add phosphorus to your composting process, phosphorus is very important for bacterial growth and food source, but it also has a dual purpose where it can immobilize certain heavy metals, very particularly lead, which is a problem that is, I'm sure, quite prevalent in Baltimore, as well as a lot of cities in America. So when you have phosphorus and it combines with lead, it creates something called lead pyromorphite, which is still lead, but it's a less bioavailable form of lead. So it's harder for that lead to move up into plants. It's a bit more innocuous. And so adding, again, extra phosphorus into your compost and then bringing that compost onto site, not only have you added all these different bacteria that can do different things, you've also created some extra immobilization potential. Compost and all the organic matter that it has and humic acid also can help immobilize different heavy metals for shorter periods of time. One thing I'll say, if you're looking at ways to add phosphorus into your compost, chicken manure is a really good option if you have access to chicken manure. And then there's, other things like kind of fish waste, fish bones, certain dynamic accumulators like buckwheat, but chicken manure would be the easiest way if you wanted to do that. Now, another way that we can actually bring in these beneficial microorganisms that are good at, let's say, breaking down chemicals is with something called actively aerated compost tea. That is basically taking some of your really amazing, really microbial rich compost that you made, taking a part of that and using that to kind of expand into a liquid so that you can kind of spray on the land, or you can drench the soil with that. And we do that with actively aerated compost tea. It allows you to inoculate your site with thousands of beneficial microorganisms. And it really helps you kind of, again, you have to have good compost, because whatever is in your compost in terms of microorganisms, that's what you're expanding out into a liquid form. If you have bad compost that lacked oxygen and kind of wasn't managed properly, there's going to be very low diversity and quantity of microorganisms in your tea. But if you have good compost, you're going to get great tea. And it's just a different way to really move those organisms onto your site, or to repeatedly kind of bring that on and continue to drench your site and also your plants and things like that. So that's a really important thing to work with actively aerated compost tea. And I will send like some recipes and things like that if you've never heard of it before. It's really important that it is very oxygenated. Sometimes people think compost tea is putting some compost in a bucket and just leaving it. That is not what we're talking about. What bacteria need to grow is they need a food source and they need oxygen. And so having the right kind of bubbler or kind of pump, you have a bucket or a larger situation, you're using dechlorinated water, you're adding some of your compost into a tea bag or some kind of like, produce bag of some sort that's like porous. And then you're adding different food sources into your water that both feed fungi and bacteria. So some people work with things like kelp and fish hydrolysate. Some folks add molasses, like that's usually kind of the combo that people are working with. And then you basically turn on a really strong bubbler or kind of oxygenator, and you can leave that for anywhere from like 12 to 16 hours. And after that point, you have this beautiful rich liquid that is teeming with microbes, and you want to get that onto your site as quick as possible, because the moment you turn out that oxygen, things start to die. But it is a really good way to keep kind of putting on contaminated soil and continuing to inoculate with things that can break chemicals down and do really good work. One thing I'll share with this is that there are very specific things you can add to your, not just the compost, but also to your compost tea mix that will bring very specific bacteria onto your site. So moving into worms, this is kind of another really special potent bioremediator. If you know anybody who has a worm bin, or people who are doing kind of worm composting, worms have an incredible role in bioremediation. But one of the ways that they can kind of play into inoculating our sites and our compost and our compost tea is that in the guts of earthworms, there is a bacteria called Pseudomonas florensis. That's about as scientific as I'm going to get today with that funky name. But this bacteria, Pseudomonas florensis, has been proven in multiple lab experiments to actually break down hydrocarbons. So if you have hydrocarbons or some kind of oil, diesel, PAHs, something like that on your site, taking worm castings, which is like the worm poop you find in your bins, and putting that into your compost, your compost tea bag, or putting some of that into your actual compost means that you're actually inoculating your compost and your compost tea with a very specific bacteria that can actually break down hydrocarbons. And so if that's an issue on your site, that's a really easy way to get that bacteria into play and actually helping on your site. Now, earthworms also do a whole bunch of other stuff. They aerate the soil, which means that it increases kind of the microbial activity and life. They increase the degradation of chemicals by that aeration and also by the bacteria that is in their gut. And that's how they inoculate the soil with key microorganisms. And again, if you have a worm bin or you want to have a worm bin, the worm castings, which is the worm poop, is incredibly helpful to so many different remediation pieces. So worms are magic, and they do incredible things. Now, another thing with microbial remediation, and this is kind of, it's not quite microbial, but it doesn't really fit into the other sections, so I always put it here, is using biochar when it comes to remediation. So biochar is different kind of biological residues that are combusted under low oxygen conditions. And what happens is you take different things, like it could be different plant waste or different wood waste or coconut. It can be a whole bunch of different things, and you burn it using kind of a biochar kiln or biochar stove. And it creates a very porous carbon material that you can kind of see in that picture there, that has a lot of kind of honeycomb, a lot of surface area. And what you end up, it looks like kind of, this black charred substance. If you take that black charred substance and you kind of dig it into your soil, it can do a whole bunch of things with the remediation. It can immobilize heavy metals. Different heavy metals will basically stick to the surface of the biochar, which means that they're not moving into your food plants or into your medicine. So they're still in the soil, but they are locked in a way that's less damaging to the different life around it. They can increase chemical breakdown because they have that really porous structure. They create a lot of habitat and surface area so that your soil can actually contain more microorganisms. And then those microorganisms can help break down different contaminants. They also increase water retention in the soil, and they can increase soil quality. They can also, adding certain biochars can also tip your soil to a more alkaline kind of pH, and that has its own benefits when it comes to dealing with certain heavy metals. But it's a really neat thing, especially when it comes to immobilizing heavy metals. Working with biochar can be really helpful. The one thing I'll just say really quickly about biochar is that it is a technology that is an indigenous technology that was discovered and kind of created in the Amazon by indigenous peoples there, who were using it a long time ago to really supercharge the fertility of the soil. And it's something that since then, folks have learned about and have started to actually do a lot of research and see how to use it in things like remediation. So the people who invented it, indigenous folks, I wanted to give credit to that. Now, another thing that people talk about when it comes to microbes is something called effective microorganisms. And this is a liquid mixture of different microorganisms. They're like lactic acid bacteria, yeast, and phototrophic bacteria, and you can kind of buy it. So it's different than compost tea where you have to make it. This, you can buy it, and it has been shown to be helpful with helping the soil in a lot of ways. I use this more when we're dealing with water situations, especially things like sludge and sewage and septic. That's where it seems to really, really shine. It does really well in anaerobic situations, like oxygen deficient situations. And there's a picture there at the bottom, those little balls. There's something called, you hear them called EM mud balls or Genki balls in Hawaii. They've been doing some really cool work of actually making these EM mud balls and throwing them kind of at the bottom of this canal that is very much a canal that was like smelling weird, really sludgy, really cloudy canal. And what it does is the different types of bacteria help kind of decompose some of the sludge and kind of oxygenate the water. And it starts what we call like a remediation cascade. And what they've seen where they've actually added some of these Genki balls is the water quality really improving itself. becoming a lot clearer, certain odors going away. So if you are doing work with, again, like things like sludge, sewage, septic, look into EM because that could be really helpful. Now, moving on, I know it's going really quickly, but we got to cover all the things. Moving into plants. So again, when we're looking at microbes, we're looking at ways to rebuild our soil, food web, to inoculate our sites with thousands and thousands of beneficial microorganisms to help break down different contaminants like chemicals. We're looking at things like biochar to help immobilize metals. That's what we're talking about with microorganisms. When we move into phytoremediation, now we're talking about working with plants and using plants to either break down chemicals or to extract things like heavy metals. And whenever we're talking about extracting heavy metals, plants are I would say the poster child of that and the most efficient at extraction. So if that's something you're looking at doing, this is your thing. Just some different pictures here in the upper left. That's a picture from New Orleans post-Hurricane Katrina, where different folks were trying out phytoremediation in the lower ninth ward, working with sunflowers to deal with some of the lead and some of the different heavy metals that were moved around and chemicals that were moved around by the floodwaters. In the upper right corner, that white little flower is called alpine pennycress. And it is an incredible lead remediator. And people don't give it as much love as sunflowers because sunflowers are big and bold and beautiful, but actually alpine pennycress is a lot more efficient at removing lead from the ground. The bottom left with that yellow plant, that is called brown mustard. It is also a really great phytoremediator when it comes to different heavy metals. And then we have different trees like willows. You can see that one in the corner that are really great, not just at dealing with kind of uptaking heavy metals, but especially excel when it comes to things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and VOCs, different chemicals. So lots of different opportunities there for remediation. Now, the key with plants is that plants can only clean the soil as far as their roots can grow. So if you have soil contamination that is really deep, maybe an old gas station site where there was a leaking underground storage tank, if your plant's roots aren't going to touch that, there's not going to be that cleanup. So it's important to kind of consider. Usually a lot of folks are interested in cleaning up the level of soil where they're planting their food crops, and therefore this works. But if you're looking at really deep contamination, you have to either look at trees or finding ways to bring that to the surface, which I don't recommend, but just keep that in mind. It's also, plants are good when it's low to moderate contamination. If you have a really, really toxic site, it may be too toxic for some of your plants to grow. And that's where we would work with the microbial remediation first, or working with working with fungi to try to moderate the site to make it habitable to plants. So you kind of have to go for that low to moderate contamination. Plants are great because they can keep contamination from moving off a site. They can reduce dust and erosion and runoff. And with heavy metals in particular, because we talk about how plants can pull up heavy metals, when a plant hyperaccumulates or extracts a heavy metal, and that heavy metal is now in the body of the plant. And so when you remove that plant itself is toxic. And you have to think about how are you going to dispose of that, right? It's not magic. The metal doesn't go into the ether. It actually is now held in the body of the plant. So it kind of needs that consideration. Now, hyperaccumulator plants are different plants that can extract heavy metals from either soil or water. And then when it comes to different chemicals, there's different grasses, nitrogen fixers, different legumes, and cover crops that are really good at breaking down chemicals. And they do that either by sucking up the chemical and kind of off-gassing it or breaking it down within their body. They also do it by sometimes creating this incredible root system that is feeding all the different bacteria and fungi, and they're the ones who are actually doing the work. So we think it's the plant that's doing the work, but it's actually the fungi and it's actually the bacteria that are breaking it down, but you need the plant in order for that to happen. Cover crops and legumes are a really good example of that. Now, I love cover cropping. When we think about cover crops and green manures and things like that in farming, like clover and buckwheat and vetches and rye, there's a lot of good research that has shown that some of these plants are really good at breaking down things like hydrocarbons, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, volatile organic compounds. And the reason is they have certain relationships with bacteria, and it's the bacteria at their root that is doing that breakdown. The other neat thing about different cover crops is they found where you plant cover crops, you actually see, I think it's triple the amount of worms in the soil. And we know from the previous conversation about worms, when you have more worms in the soil, they are aerating the soil and they are inoculating the soil with that very specific bacteria that breaks down hydrocarbons. So you can do a lot of really beautiful kind of passive remediation if you have chemicals by working with different cover crops. Trees, I mentioned this earlier, if you are dealing with deeper contamination, trees are kind of going to be better at that in terms of getting to a deeper level in the soil. And also a key thing when it comes to pulling up either chemicals or heavy metals is the bigger the biomass. So I like to think of like the bigger the head of hair that, you know, the leaves and everything of the plant, the bigger above ground portion of the plant, the more you can actually pull up. So when you get really big organisms like trees and they're established, they have a huge capacity to actually do that cleanup work. And so it's important for us to kind of invest in that now. And give that resilience to our landscapes and get those trees going. Again, some of the ones that have been really well researched are things like poplar and willow when it comes to doing a whole bunch of different chemical breakdown. Now, everybody loves talking about hyperaccumulators. These are the plants that pull up heavy metals. Some people refer to them as little solar-powered vacuum cleaners. Some plants are more effective at pulling up heavy metals than others. So just because you read somewhere that a plant can do it, it doesn't mean it's the best plant. So you want to kind of dig in a little bit deeper. But, you know, I mentioned this earlier, brown mustard is an incredibly good plant when it comes to pulling up heavy metals. A lot of brassicas, because they don't have mycorrhizal fungi, are just like a very easy kind of clean kind of extraction mechanism to kind of pull and like sequester heavy metals. The picture in the middle is actually the Chinese ladder break fern, which is incredibly efficient at pulling up arsenic. And I know arsenic is often an issue in different urban areas. And then of course we have sunflowers, which people love. And sunflowers have been, you know, shown to do really good work on a different spectrum of heavy metals. And people like them because of what they represent and the kind of their ability to really beautify a space. So this is just a quick list and you will get my slides. So don't feel like you have to write it all down, but this is just some different plants that are actually tested, tried true in different literature, scientific literature at breaking, or sorry, not breaking down, sorry, at hyperaccumulating different heavy metals. So you can see, you know, brown mustard is in, you know, it's good for lead, it's good for zinc, it's good for chromium, cadmium, it's good for nickel and copper. So that's a pretty common one that's good to work with. You'll see sunflowers show up quite a bit there as well. Alfalfa is also good at hyperaccumulating lead, as is alpine pennycress. That's one of the better ones to work with. I will say lead is one of the most talked about heavy metals. It's also one of the hardest to pull out of the soil because lead is very clunky and it doesn't want to move. And so any of these plants are going to be slow at doing that with lead. You can do it, but it's just something to keep in mind. Whereas certain things like cadmium and arsenic might move a lot quicker. You'll see for arsenic, we have different ferns that have shown to be really helpful when it comes to hyperaccumulating arsenic. Also things like, this is not, you're not growing rice, but important to know that rice hyperaccumulates arsenic. So if you eat a lot of rice, you don't know where it's coming from, you might want to be careful about that. I also added a few herbs to the mix because I was just researching that. But, you know, things like mugwort are quite good at hyperaccumulating zinc. Calendula and horsetail can pull up lead. You know, marigolds and horsetail can pull up chromium. There's a whole bunch of different things there. But it's important if you collect medicines to kind of know that if they're in certain contaminated environments, they might be able to pull that up. And that means that you have to think about the health of using that. And what I recommend is, these are just a few examples. In your area, if there are, you know, local plants that you are really interested in, you can always kind of do a bit of a Google search and say like this plant, hyperaccumulator, and whatever metal you're worried about. And that'll show you a bunch of different kind of scientific papers, and you kind of read through and find out, you know, is this actually a good species to either use to extract heavy metals, or if I'm trying to wild harvest this, should I be worried? And there's always more research happening where people are really looking at different plants in their area and trying to kind of add more to lists, that it's not just certain like things around sunflowers. Like there's a lot of different plants you can work with. Now, when it comes to hyperaccumulating heavy metals in the plant, it's important to know that heavy metals move to different parts of the plant. And so I like to talk about this just from a food justice perspective. There's something called fate of transport, and that is where different heavy metals end up in the plants. Sometimes we may not have, 5-10 years or 2 to 5 years to, hyperaccumulate and clean up the soil. People need their food and they need to eat it now. And so in that situation, knowing where different metals might accumulate in the plant might be the difference between whether you can actually safely eat that or not, or safely utilize that plant or not. So another thing you can do is you can actually look up things like fate of transport, tomatoes, lead, use some of those keywords to kind of figure out like where are different heavy metals ending up in the plant. But just an example, different heavy metals also will end up in different parts of the plant, depending on the plant, depending on the metal. So sunflowers, it's a common thing where when people plant sunflowers in heavy metal contaminated soil, they're worried about the sunflower head and it going to seed and then birds kind of eating the seeds and getting sick. But what's interesting is when it comes to lead contamination, they've done studies where the lead tends to get stuck kind of in the roots and kind of the shoots of the plant, and they don't actually make it up to the seeds because lead is a kind of a more clunky metal and it doesn't tend to move that easily. But if you have soil that has cadmium, you will find cadmium in the sunflower seeds. So it's important to kind of know that difference, right? Often with lead, we are most worried about it being kind of in the lower leaves and kind of the roots and the shoots of the plants, but especially the roots. And if you have plants that are kind of leafy greens that are kind of right on the soil, the biggest way that lead gets onto those greens is not because it's been sucked up into the green, but because things like rain and wind move the soil dust onto the plant surface, right? So just important things to note. Now with heavy metals, it gets a little complicated. There are two different types of heavy metals, and this is important if you're trying to extract heavy metals or immobilize them. So we have something called cationic metals, and these are lead, cadmium, copper, mercury, and zinc. And then we have something called anionic metals, which are things like chromium and arsenic. And the thing about that is that the cationic metals and the anionic metals react differently to the pH of the soil. So if you are trying to extract or immobilize, this is important. If you have more acidic soil, that means that your cationic metals like lead and cadmium are going to be more mobile, which means if you have more acidic soil and you want to try to extract lead and cadmium, that's a good idea because it's more likely to move up into your plant, right? So you can get rid of it. By that same token, if you have more acidic soil and you're trying to eat plants from that, you should be more worried about if you have things like cadmium, lead, and zinc, because they're more likely to be able to get into your plant and cause you problems. If you have more alkaline soil, that lead and that cadmium, those cationic metals, is more immobilized. So it's harder to pull it out of the soil, and it's also moving around less. And so one thing that people do is that if they're trying to hyperaccumulate things, they'll look at the soil pH. And if you're dealing with quite alkaline soil and you're trying to hyperaccumulate lead, I wouldn't do that. You just wouldn't do that. You would basically say, we're going to try to immobilize the lead instead, because it's already kind of bound up. How do we make that even safer? But if the soil is acidic, we're going to try to take it out, right? And you can also do things to actually shift the pH of your soil. Let's say you didn't want to extract it, but you wanted to make it more immobilized. You would try to do things to add and amend your soil to become more alkaline. If you really wanted to try to make it more acidic to extract, you also could do that. So just kind of look at your soil pH, do a little quick soil pH test before you decide to extract or immobilize, depending on what heavy metals you're working with. Now, the awkward thing is that anionic metals are the opposite. So when you have soil pH conditions that are acidic, your lead and your cadmium as cationic metals are more available, but things like arsenic and chromium are more immobilized. And alternatively, when the soil pH is more alkaline, so like above 7, things like arsenic and chromium are like moving around and having a party. So this is awkward because a lot of our sites often have both. Like lead and arsenic were in lots of different pesticides together. They were in lots of different, past usage. So you will often have a site that has both lead and arsenic, or might have lead and chromium. And if that's the case, you kind of have to decide, which ones do you want to try to extract? Which ones do you want to immobilize? Do you want to do that first and then switch to that? And you can't do it all at once. It's a kind of a bit of a different process, but it's important to know that, because it can be, you don't want to be fighting an uphill battle, try to extract something from the soil when it's kind of wanting to stay where it is. Now, with hyperaccumulating, we mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but if you suck up heavy metals into your plants, then the plant itself may become toxic. And if you can't test a plant to know what level of toxicity in it, you kind of have to assume it is, right? And so in that situation, there is no beautiful answer where the metal moves into the plant and now everything's good. Heavy metals are jerks and they're with us for a long time. And so if you have planted a bunch of, let's say, brown mustard, and you use it to pull up lead or cadmium, then after you've kind of done a cycle of that, you have to collect all that brown mustard and figure out what to do with it. What you would never do, you would never compost that brown mustard down and then spread it on a vegetable patch. That is a hard no. You never do that, because then you're just re-spreading the heavy metal contaminated kind of onto the soil. So you're never going to do that. That's a big no. But what some people do is they either bag it up and they send it away to like a landfill or a toxic landfill. And that is not great, but it's a lot better than the conventional remediation solution that would have been to landfill all of that soil in massive amounts of tonnage. This is a way smaller volume of what you're actually disposing of. That is a fairly easy option. There are other places where people incinerate the waste, which has its own problems in terms of releasing certain things to the air. So I don't recommend that. Some folks have looked at, choosing a part of their site, which is kind of going to be a sacrifice zone, where they're basically composting that contaminated plant waste down, and adding things like biochar and kind of organic waste and phosphorus to kind of bind it and just try to reduce its volume. And then maybe kind of feeding that to different long-lived trees that are not fruit bearing or anything like that, just trying to find ways to sequester it on site, but never bringing it into a situation where you're doing food production from that. So that's the thing. Often I tell people it's better to try to immobilize if you can, because the moment you extract, you have to figure out what you're going to do with it. Not impossible, but just depends what you're into. Now, lead, as I mentioned, you have two choices. You can extract it or you can immobilize it. If you have more acidic soil, then you can extract it using different plants like sunflowers, brown mustard, alpine pennycress. And that's one way to go. If your soil is more alkaline, where lead would be more immobilized, you would do things like add phosphorus to the soil, because we talked about how that can help lock up the lead. There was projects, I think in Oakland, where they were doing that. It was the EPA who was trying it out with actually like fish, some kind of fish material that was adding lots of phosphorus. So you can add things like phosphorus, you can add lots of compost and things like that. And that is kind of looking at immobilizing. Often, even if you extract first, you're still going to end up with some left in the soil. And so in the end, you're going to have to find ways to immobilize it. And one of the best things with lead is finding ways to cover it, because again, a lot of the ways that lead gets into plants and onto people and animals is the dust of it. It's like raindrops hit it, it splashes up and it contaminates from that point. So what we often see on lead sites is finding ways to put down mulch and cover the soil, finding ways to do sheet mulching and kind of grow up, because you really want to limit how much of that soil dust is kind of moving onto things. So two different options there. But whatever you do, you want to try to find a way to cover the soil and limit that from happening. A few more quick precautions with lead. If you are working in lead contaminated soil, your clothing, your shoes, everything, again, that lead dust can really get on you. You want to kind of not bring those indoors, not hug your family with it. Wearing a face mask and gloves are a really good idea, because you don't want to be breathing in that lead soil. Washing your hands, taking a shower after you do that garden work and before eating. A few other things with lead is we know, because lead was used in paint up until I think the 1970s. We have a lot of heavy lead contamination, often on a property closest to the home, in about 10 feet, kind of closest to the home, and also from the roads, because we used to use lead in gasoline as well. You will often see the highest concentrations of lead. In permaculture, we're always telling people to plant right up against the house, right? That is not a good idea when it comes to remediation, because all that paint and stuff that was chipping has kind of been sitting and landing in the soil right next to kind of where there's a structure. So locate your veggie gardens away from older structures, as well as highly trafficked roads. That's a hard one for me, because I used to love boulevard gardens, and you can do that, but you just have to be conscious of what you're growing and choose different things, right? As I mentioned, you want to cover the bare soil to reduce that lead dust from moving around. You can use ground cover, you can use mulch, anything that kind of makes it so that kids and animals don't get all into it. You want to avoid eating the roots of plants as much as possible, and peeling it. But just in general, if I had heavily lead contaminated soil, I wouldn't eat potatoes or beets or carrots or anything like that grown into it. I would also avoid eating brassicas, because again, we know that our mustard greens, some of our different kind of broccolis, things like that, are really good hyperaccumulators. So I would avoid that, as well as spinach. And if you can, you want to grow in raised beds with clean soil, or within a thick sheet mulch that you've kind of grown up from. Okay, we are good. We still have time for mushrooms. So now moving on to fungi. That's a different topic. We're going to move away from the metals, because metals and mushrooms are not as efficient as metals and plants in terms of being able to remove things. But mushrooms are really, really incredible when it comes to immobilizing metals, as well as breaking down chemicals. They get a lot of their kind of fanfare and love from their ability to break down things like hydrocarbons, pesticides, dioxin. People love mushrooms. On the slide, we have in the left oyster mushrooms, which are a remediation superstar. We have shaggy mane in the bottom that are actually quite good at hyperaccumulating arsenic. We have King Stropharia, or the garden giant, or wine cap, which is that red mushroom at the top. And that is a really good mushroom, not only for growing with other plants, for using in gray water systems or rain gardens and things like that, because it has a really good ability to kind of work with bacteria and other species, but it's also incredibly good at dealing with excess nutrients and E. coli, and kind of remediating that piece. And then we have turkey tail at the bottom, which is a really great mushroom when it comes to filtration, breaking down hydrocarbons. I'm actually working on a project in Northern Canada where we're looking at using turkey tail to break down creosote rail ties. And it's already shown some really good potential for that. So mushrooms are amazing, especially when it comes to chemical breakdown and filtering contaminated water. Now, the mushrooms that we tend to work with a lot when it comes to mycoremediation is what we call saprophytic fungi. And these are the fungi that, their evolutionary role, what they do in the land and in the forest, is they are the great decomposers. They break down, woody debris in the forest and kind of bring things like, trees and stuff that are sick and dying or dead. They kind of bring that full cycle into kind of new life. And so their ability to look at different things like lignin and cellulose and break them apart, it allows them to do the same thing with certain chemicals that are similar in terms of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And so that's kind of part of their magic when it comes to looking at petrochemicals and saying, okay, I can work with this. This could be a food source. So saprophytic fungi, really good at doing that. And how they do it, this is another thing with humans, for example, when we are trying to break something down in our bodies, we ingest it, we eat it, and then we digest it. Whereas these saprophytic fungi, what they do is they actually digest, they release these enzymes into the soil or onto the kind of the substance that they're trying to eat. They break it down with those enzymes in order to actually ingest it. So when you get a lot of this kind of mycelium, this fungi in the soil, there's a lot of great work that's happening with those enzymes when it comes to remediation. Now, this is just the life cycle of a mushroom. So what we focus on a lot in remediation is actually not the mature mushroom or the fruiting body, which is like what y'all know is an actual, like, here's a mushroom, I can see it. We focus a lot on the actual like living body of the fungi, which is the mycelium. So when you see that kind of white, kind of branching, kind of spider web structure, also in those bags, That's the mycelium. And it's the mycelium that's releasing all the enzymes and doing that incredible remediation work. When I look at kind of a mushroom and kind of difference between mushroom and mycelium and spore is like the seeds of a plant. The mycelium is like the body of the plant. And then something like a mushroom would be like an apple or a tomato on the plant, right? And so just kind of understanding that. Sometimes when we're dealing with things like heavy metal accumulation, we care about getting a mushroom to fruit, to actually have like a physical thing to remove from the environment. But most often when we're working with actual chemicals, we're trying to just get as much mycelium going and mycelium into the environment as possible. This is just a list of different, some of the different fungi, and it's, again, not comprehensive. There's a lot more out there, but some of the different chemicals that we've seen, good results with. So as I mentioned, turkey tails, things like, PAHs, explosives, elm oyster, dioxin, wood preservatives like creosote, turkey tail, pearl oysters. Again, you're seeing some of the chemicals like dioxin, PAHs, PCBs. Shaggy mane, it says really good for accumulating certain heavy metals like arsenic, cadmium, and mercury. So that's important. And as I mentioned earlier, King Stropharia, quite good when it comes to E. coli and other biological contaminants. Now, I always want to give props. I learned about mushrooms from Paul Stamets, who is an incredible mycologist, wrote the book Mycelium Running a long time ago, and kind of got a lot of people in kind of popular culture excited about microremediation. And a while back, he was part of a competition where there was I think it was a diesel spill in Washington. And what ended up happening is there was an opportunity for folks to take different piles of diesel contaminated soil and find ways to remediate it. And he entered into that competition and took a diesel contaminated soil, inoculated it with oyster mushrooms, as well as either wood chips or straw, because the mushrooms kind of need that extra kind of their substrate. They're kind of where they live and they eat is things like carbon, right? So he added wood chips and straw. He added oyster mushroom mycelium to this pile of oil, diesel contaminated soil. And then over the period of 16 weeks, he saw that amount of diesel go down from 10,000 parts per million to less than 200 parts per million, which is pretty substantial. And he saw, oyster mushrooms kind of grow from that. And also all these other things happen in terms of it was attracting insects and birds, and they were like pooping on the pile and plants are growing. And it was kind of that got people really excited about the potential of this work. And so there's other folks who are kind of doing that today and still trying that kind of piece out in terms of piles of dirt that have, petroleum contamination in it and working with things like oyster mushrooms, but pretty neat to see that happen. Everybody always asks, can you eat those mushrooms? I would not. But with things like diesel, I would be less worried about it. If there's any substance that has a heavy metal, I would never, you don't eat the mushroom with that. But ideally try to find something cleaner to eat than, whatever's growing on your remediation pile. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but one of the ways that mushrooms excel in remediation is their ability to filter and to act as like a, filtration system to intercept contaminated runoff. Mycelium, you can see the picture on the left, that's a blown up picture of mycelium. It creates this really dense, beautiful web that not only acts as a physical kind of filter with different things running through it, but then you have the added effect of the different enzymes that can break down different chemicals, or you have the mycelium that can hyperaccumulate metals. So the picture in the middle is what we call a bunker bag. That's where you basically take mycelium, things like straw and wood chips, and you fill that bag, and then you wait like 4 to 6 weeks for that mycelium to take over the bag. And at that point where you see it kind of coming out onto the burlap, that's when you know that you actually have a good little filter, like a microfilter, and you can install that in the path of contaminated runoff. So if you have maybe runoff coming onto your site from some kind of toxic place, you could use that as a filter. If you have something going on, like we've seen a lot of this kind of post-fire. This is just an example. These really rad folks called Co-Renewal down in California, in the aftermath of some of the big fires in the West, they were actually trying to protect their water and the watershed and kind of the streams that were below these big burns. And so they installed what we call like a myceliated wattle. It's just like a, burlappy kind of straw wattle with oyster mushroom mycelium in it. so that when the rains come, all those toxic chemicals and heavy metals like dioxin and everything like that will go through that filter, hopefully reduce their amounts or kind of lock them in, and so that they don't actually get into the streams. So there's a lot of really neat ways to work with mushrooms in that way. You can also work with biochar that way too, by the way, but two different options. Now, just a quick thing to say, people often want to use mushrooms to pull up heavy metals because mushrooms are very sexy right now. I don't advise that, because what we have found is fungi is really good at immobilizing heavy metals, like sequestering it. But it's hard to actually get them to move those metals into what we would call a fruiting body. So if you have a lot of mycelium in the soil, it's this filamentous structure in the soil, the metals will end up maybe being held in the mycelium. But if you want to remove that and extract that from the environment, that's really difficult to do. Whereas with plants, we're removing a plant, like an isolated plant. With mushrooms, they could actually create, again, like the fruiting body. So you'll see the above ground mushroom, and you could pick that as a way of removing the metal. But different studies have shown that the metal doesn't always move into the fruiting body and sometimes gets held in the mycelium. So it's a bit less of a predictable thing than with the plants. So I don't recommend people using mushrooms to hyperaccumulate metals in a way that you're trying to extract it. If you are trying to use mycelium to immobilize and sequester metals, that makes sense. And that is more doable, but just want to make a note of that. Now, I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but we have different types of fungi. And I talked about the saprophytic fungi, the decomposers, like our oyster mushrooms and our turkey tails. We also have a type of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi. And this is the fungi that we see kind of growing in kind of symbiotic relationships on, let's say, like the root systems of plants. They help plants access all these extra nutrients in the soil and water, and they give plants drought resistance, and they help communicate. They're incredible. And they're harder to see to the naked eye. Sometimes if you pull a plant out, you might see these little white hairs, but you don't tend to see them as same as like a mushroom like that you see pop up. But these kind of different types of mycorrhizal fungi, for example, a certain type called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi has a relationship with 90% of all plants. Not brassicas, but 90% of all plants. And what they found is this type of mycorrhizal fungi, it improves plant health, it increases resilience to drought, it also increases resilience to toxicity. So if you were trying to grow plants on a toxic site, like let's say you're trying to grow plants that are going to break down chemicals or something on a toxic site, but the site is so toxic that it's hard for the plant to actually survive, inoculating your plants with mycorrhizal fungi could help them manage that toxicity better. So it's a way to kind of allow that to happen. They also can increase salt tolerance in plants. One of the things that it's a bit of a debate between, do mycorrhizal fungi help pull up heavy metals into the plants, or do they hold it at the soil level? I tend to use mycorrhiza for more, if you want your plants to survive, it can help them survive and grow more rigorously. So therefore, they're more likely to be able to survive on site and be able to take up more, chemicals and things like that. They have also been found, like if you were trying to grow food crops, you didn't have enough time to clean your soil. If you were to inoculate the roots of your food crops with mycorrhizal fungi, they might actually inhibit the heavy metals from moving into your plant, because they're trying to keep the plant alive. So they might actually sequester the heavy metals at kind of the root level and keep them from moving up into your plant, which might make it safer to eat some of your things like the fruit that's growing on it or the vegetables that's coming off it. So they're neat in that way, and they're just an extra tool that you can utilize. They're also really important to soil health. Some people learn how to actually grow their own mycorrhizal fungi. You can also buy inoculant at a garden center and just make sure you're dipping your plants into that before you plant them on site. So we're in the final slide. This is our final slide before questions. I know this was a lot, and I'm going to send resources, but one thing I always like to end on is, we talked about some of the different plants and mushrooms, as well as bacteria, that are good at helping regenerate and restore and revitalize the land and the waters that we love. But some of the same things that are hurting those lands and some of the same like kind of heavy metals and chemicals that are present are also hurting our bodies, right? We can't really separate ourselves from the land in that way. And what we see in communities where there's heavy metals and lots of chemicals, where there's, either that kind of legacy contamination or kind of, constant pollution from refineries and things like that, we see things like people have a lot of inflammation in their bodies. They have higher levels of cancer, higher levels of respiratory illnesses, autoimmune diseases. And there are different herbs and, fungi that also help our bodies kind of detox and weather those storms as well. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to those. So just a few examples, and I can also send out a little resource around if you're working in contamination and you want to keep yourself and your crew a little healthier. There are different herbs and plants and kind of dietary things you can do to support your body as you do this really important work. A few of the superstars, just off kind of the top of my head, reishi mushroom is an incredible mushroom, both in the sense of kind of, anti-inflammatory, kind of anti-cancer, also really good for helping people when they're dealing with things like multiple chemical sensitivity. It can kind of chill out and help the nervous system in a lot of different ways. Lion's mane mushroom, which is the mushroom on the right side, that white kind of beautiful cascading mushroom, that's an incredible mushroom when it comes to supporting the brain, as well as the nervous system. And when people are dealing with a lot of contamination and also some of the autoimmune and other illnesses that come from being in contamination, things that help with brain health and brain fog and your central nervous system are crucial. So there's been some beautiful work of kind of lion's mane and what it does. Things like maitake mushroom are really good for supporting your liver, which is critical when it comes to dealing with toxins, as well as dealing with things off cancers. So beautiful, like try to incorporate medicinal mushrooms into your practice if you're doing work with contaminants. The picture in the middle bottom of that beautiful kind of white and green plant, that is milk thistle. And that is one of my favorite plants because milk thistle is incredible when it comes to supporting and healing the liver. And if we are around a lot of toxins, our livers take a hit. And so having a healthy liver is really important to having a healthy body as a bioremediator. So working with milk thistle seed is the seed that's really helpful. Using tincture or kind of grating it up on your salad, that's a really helpful practice. Other bitters like dandelion, burdock, also good to incorporate. Cilantro, which is also there. Cilantro is a good herb for helping kind of pull out and chelate heavy metals in the body. So there's some folks who kind of bring in a little bit more cilantro into their diet. Anytime you're trying to remove heavy metals from your body, you need to drink a lot of water, as well as eat a lot of fiber so that it's moving out. You're not just kind of pulling it out, you're kind of into your body. You got to get it out of the thing in the end. Also things like mullein, which is in the lower left corner, that's really good for lung support. Red clover is really good for kind of, again, like the blood, and also endocrine support. We have a lot of chemicals that are endocrine disruptors and wreak havoc on our hormones, and that can cause a whole bunch of problems. So things like red clover, flax, hawthorn, and a bunch of others can support us in that way. So, we have to take care of ourselves and our community as we do this work. And we have a lot of plant and fungi allies who can do it. And also I'll say, and I mentioned this with lead, but anytime you are working with contaminants, take precautions, right? If you are ever working around chemicals, like if there's an oil spill or any kind of thing where if you can like smell it in the air or you're starting to feel dizzy or get a headache, you need to be wearing like a respirator. You don't want to be breathing some of that stuff in. If you're working with heavy metals in the soil, again, like a simple dust mask, an N95 is better, but you just don't want to be inhaling these things. You don't want to be getting them on your skin. If you are taking a shower after doing this kind of work, a cold shower is better than a hot shower, because when we do hot showers, it opens our pores and it also makes more kind of like mist and stuff that we can breathe in, whereas a cold shower kind of gets it off us without kind of it getting inside us. But there's a lot of different tips to stay healthy. So that's it. I won't go too much farther into Q&A and we can answer some questions. And I just want to say, shout out, we got a few folks on this webinar who are from the Rise A Renewal Collective in Baltimore, who do incredible phytoremediation work. And I love their project. That's a picture of their beautiful work, Morgan and Robin. And so I just wanted to end it on that since we are in Baltimore.
Thank you so much, Leila. Wow, I am so glad I am recording this presentation so I can watch it a bunch of times and take more notes. And wow, such incredible knowledge packed into just an hour. Wow, thank you.
I hope it wasn't too fast. If I spoke too quickly, I apologize to everyone. I'm sorry.
No, it's not you. It's you. You were perfect. You were perfect. I just, I enjoy to go through and research everything and yeah, take more notes. So
Mhm.
thank you so much. And yeah, it looks like we got some good questions in the chat. So Jan was asking about how do you know if you have good balanced compost or compost tea? And then also asked if there's soil testing for compost.
Yes. So how do you know if you have good, there's several things. If you're really passionate about composting, I mean, again, I'm sure there's master compost courses. There's also the soil food web folks, Elaine Ingham's. She's an incredible soil scientist, remediator, soil restoration human, but her school, they do a lot of online courses about how do you make like the best kind of like microbial rich compost and compost teas. And part of what they teach is also how to actually analyze, like parts of your compost and your compost tea under a microscope, and to look for the different, like the right kind of composition of like the different bacteria, fungi, and protozoa. So you can do that. And if you kind of, there might be videos about it online, but if you want to like look into her courses, Elaine Ingham, Soil Food Web, they do teach how to do that kind of analysis and to kind of know what you're looking for. They tend to be oriented more towards soil restoration than remediation. So it's sometimes less about breaking down versus like restoring the soil food web. Just to be clear about that, because it can be a little different, but the principles of like getting that really microbial rich compost and compost tea are like absolutely the same. And they, I feel like, do the best kind of training when it comes to how do you test it and how do you look at it. And they really, it's about kind of like putting it on a little slide under a microscope and being like, who's there, On an easier note, far easier than that, and how I've always done it, because I'm not a microscope person, probably to my detriment, but if you do the process right, so if you kind of have the right mix of carbon and nitrogen materials, and you kind of, you get them into your compost, you build the compost to the right size, in terms of at minimum 4x4, 4 feet by 4 feet. And then what you would do with thermophilic composting is you have a compost thermometer that you kind of put into your compost and you check it. And when it hits specific temperatures, then you're supposed to kind of turn the compost. And there's kind of a series of temperatures you hit that kind of are telling you that the right processes are happening, right? If you kind of monitor that way and you kind of follow the process correctly, you don't notice any weird smells happening. Weird smells are bad. So if your thing smells like rotten or like funky in a bad way, that means your compost is crap. If it smells kind of anaerobic, if it smells like the swamp, but not the good swamp, that means your compost is bad, right? If your compost looks really wet and heavy and smells weird, that means you probably grew a lot of anaerobic and not aerobic bacteria. So there's a lot of ways to also just kind of eyeball it and get a good feel for like, what you're looking at and what you're smelling, and if you're hitting the right temperatures. That's another way if you don't want to get all into the microscopes. And again, if you put the right things in it, like as I mentioned, like adding worm castings, adding phosphorus, right? Making sure like you squeeze your compost and it's kind of like a wrung out sponge. It's not too dry, but it's not too wet. There's a bunch of different tips there. And I can see if I can include some of that in the resources I send Morgan. Same thing, compost tea, by the way. If your compost tea smells gnarly, that's another thing. There's one thing when they use molasses, it always smells good when you use molasses. So that's not always a good indicator, right? Some folks believe that if you use molasses, you get too much bacteria. It really, really pumps the bacteria in the tea more than the fungi. But depending on what you're doing on site, like if I was dealing with hydrocarbons, I would want bacteria. So I would continue to use the molasses, but use it, and maybe if you find a recipe, use it in like half of what that recipe says, and make sure you include things like the fish hydrolysate or kelp to make sure that you're also feeding the fungi.
Thank you so much for that, Leila. So Robin was asking, would you say more about the micromediation project you engaged in with turkey tails?
Yeah. So I'm from Canada originally. And I've been supporting an amazing group up in northern British Columbia called the Skeena Watershed Conservation Coalition. The Skeena in northern BC is like one of the greatest salmon rivers we have in Canada. It's a really powerful place. And there's a lot of huge piles of creosote rail ties that one of the railroad giants has like just left randomly, especially in Indigenous territory. And so we've been looking at, can we use microremediation to try to break down these creosote rail ties? And the first phase of our experiment was actually try to find like which fungi did it best. And we looked at a bunch of different, we looked at playing with oyster mushrooms, turkey tails, chicken of the woods, elm oyster, a few local varieties of oyster mushrooms. If you're ever doing work in kind of a wilder setting, it's always the best practice to use like local species instead of some kind of outsider species. And what we never use invasive species, not in plants, not in mushrooms. We avoid that. So we tried a whole bunch of different things. And we also did something that's called training the mycelium. This is a really cool thing with fungi where you can actually introduce your fungi to a contaminant and see kind of which fungi is excited about it. Not all of them will be as excited as maybe one is really stoked on creosote. We found out that turkey tail and M oyster were the most excited about the creosote. They grew towards it, they were stoked. And then once we found that out, we actually just kind of kept growing out our turkey tail mycelium and adding more and more creosote to the mix to acclimatize the turkey tail to being like, this is your food source and you love it. And you're going to, do really well if we put you on a creosote rail tie. And so that was kind of the first phase of our project of trying to actually develop this very specialized turkey tail creosote, fungi partner. And now we're at that place where we're looking at how are we going to get it to break down a really dense, thick, gross rail tie. And all the different ways we're going to get that mycelium packed into that rail tie or drilled into it or whatnot. And then from there, we'll look at the bigger piles. The one thing I'll say about the creosote, we did our first phase where we actually just did it in bags. We had creosote shavings and mycelium, and we tested it before and after, and we saw some huge reductions in the chemicals. So it was definitely doing the work, but we weren't testing for heavy metals. And creosote is all these phenols and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and gnarly chemicals because it's a mix of stuff, but it also has arsenic and chromium. And what we know is that, again, in bioremediation, you can't break down a heavy metal. So in a situation like that, we broke down certain chemicals, but the heavy metals would be left in the mycelium, and we would have to figure out a way to dispose of it. So that's maybe a little too sciencey, but that's what we're working on.
That's so fascinating. Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
I also used to be one of those urban gardeners who was like, I made a garden bed out of creosote rail ties. And I have learned, and I don't do that anymore. That's bad. So,
Yeah.
now we're trying to handle those differently.
Well, that's so inspirational to know that there, are options being developed, because I know that's a big resource in Baltimore that a lot of urban gardeners use and I'll see all around. But yeah, thank you for the groundbreaking work you're doing with that. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, Luis asked, should beekeepers be concerned with some of the contaminants from the flowers being pollinated?
It's a really good question, Luis. I think that's something I don't know as much about, because I would imagine, like, again, like we talked with the heavy metals, it's like them moving from soil to root to shoot to leaf to flower and then to pollen, right? Like that's like a lot of like movement. It would depend on the heavy metal. If you're dealing with lead contamination, I would not be as worried about that. If you're dealing with like a place that has a lot of cadmium, I would be less worried about the pollen, but it is something to consider. I'm going to actually look into that question. And if I find a better answer, I'll email you and make sure that Morgan gets it to you, because it's something that I haven't been as worried about, but I worry more like when people spray the plants and it's like the pesticides and everything is on it. And so the bee gets it on its body as it's interacting with it. But it's really about kind of like that fate of transport, like where is it ending up in the plant, right?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And thank you for the follow-up with that.
I will. I'm interested in this because I love bees, so I will follow up.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
please. And I think I missed one. Mark had asked if there's a site for the composting. So I guess like, yeah, what we were talking about. Maybe if you just want to follow up with like a resource for that after,
Yes.
that could be cool. Um, and then Anna asked, or well, said, I live in Fells Point in a row house, and I pulled up some of the concrete for a garden. I did add some compost and garden soil. Is it safe to eat tomatoes and herbs grown in my garden?
Um, it depends. It depends on like what is in the garden, right? So you pull this from the concrete. I mean, it really depends on I would say, Anna, like what chemicals or what heavy metals, like what was there before, if you know anything about what was there before. Um, and also like where is that, like you pulled up the concrete, but like where is that in relation to, like is it close to the house, is it close to the road, are you worried about lead paint or certain things being in the soil, has there been a fire there, did it used to have some weird industrial use, like that would give a lot more information. What you could do is you could see if you can test the soil, like the pH, you can get those pH strips, um, and again see, are you dealing with more acidic or alkaline soil, because if you're worried about, again, something like lead or cadmium, nickel, any of those cationic metals, if the soil is more alkaline, they would be less likely to be able to move into your tomato, right? Like it's just going to be a clunkier thing. Um, I think if you add compost, that's helpful. I would try to add more and grow up so that your plants are not kind of interacting with what you think might be contaminated soil. So if you're in a situation where you haven't had the opportunity to do remediation, then it's like you would rather do more of a raised bed situation, and kind of have like the roots of your plants and everything in cleaner soil than having them kind of like in something questionable. I would also, if I were you, like if you're planting tomatoes and herbs, do that thing we talked about where you inoculate it with the mycorrhizal fungi, because that might also, again, keep some of that contamination from moving up into your food and keep it more at the soil level. But if you want to keep bringing in compost and add some phosphorus into the mix, like do some compost tea, those are all good things. But if you haven't done the deeper work with it, I would grow up on that. And again, with the herbs that you're growing, I think from the list I said, there's certain herbs like mugwort, and a few others that are actually pretty good at hyperaccumulating metals, things like nettles, for example. Like you want to kind of get an idea of what herbs you're growing, and you can look them up and actually look them up as like a phytoremediator hyperaccumulator, and just make sure that that's not what they do, and that'll protect you a little bit more.
Thank you so much for that.
Mhm.
Okay, Peg asked, Leila, what is your academic background, please? I worked with bioremediation projects for 20 years for contaminated groundwater. Your talk has been wonderful. Also, you're getting lots of love in the chat, so
I love you guys.
your
Thank
talk
you.
is check it out.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm certain Peg is smarter than me. She worked for 20 years in contaminated groundwater. Contaminated groundwater is hard, I think, compared to soil. That's something with the bioremediation that I do is very much community based. And when I talk to people about it, it's like we're looking at soil, we're looking at surface water. The moment you get into groundwater, you get into like open ocean, it becomes a lot harder to do, if impossible, with kind of more like low tech kind of grassroots options. So, I mean, I'd like to pick Peg's brain about the work they've been doing, because I'm sure that's really, really interesting work. My academic background, I have a bachelor in environmental science from very long ago. And I have a master's in disaster resilience, which is more for the disaster work I do. And so a lot of the bioremediation work and the bioremediation knowledge I have, I self-taught because I was just really interested in it. And I got an opportunity to write a book about it. So I had to learn about it really fast. So, and there's something I'll say to a lot of folks. There's a lot of people who are in this field, especially from the mushroom side of things, who taught themselves everything they know. And it's really neat to see that kind of citizen scientist, like people just like really not being afraid to kind of dig in and not being intimidated by it, because we need to see more of this work happening. We need this work to be done properly. And so we can't have folks cutting corners or people being like, I'm, composting my metal plants and putting them on my garden. Like, we don't want any of that. We want people to actually get some of the subtleties, but it's important that people feel empowered to do this in their community, right? Like, you don't necessarily need a degree to do any of this, but there's a lot of really good trainings Like if you want to get more into microbial remediation, you know, looking at becoming a really good composter, maybe taking some soil food web classes or a master composter class. If you're really interested in plants, making sure you know how to grow them, right? And propagate. If you're really interested in mushrooms and microremediation, taking mycocultivation classes and learning how to cultivate is really important to understanding how mushrooms work and how to remediate, and being a person in your community who can do that. Or specializing in learning how to do biochar, right? There's a lot of information that's kind of readily available. And I really think it's cool for people to kind of specialize in stuff and then group up together. And again, understand that there's so many tools in the toolkit, and not to get into just using mushrooms or plants or one thing to kind of fix it. But yeah, I would love to learn more about contaminated groundwater, because that's often something that we don't really know how to manage from a more kind of community bioremediation standpoint.
Thank you so much. So I put one resource in the chat about this, but and I know you're also based in Canada, but Erin was asking about where to send soil samples, or if there's like a government website for
Mm.
soil testing, or something that you could recommend for
Yeah,
places.
you put a really good one. It's kind of depending on where you live. It always changes. Like there's certain universities and extension, kind of rural extension kind of university labs that do offer cheaper soil testing, especially for things like lead. It can actually be fairly easy in some of the major cities to get your soil tested for lead. If you're trying to test for different chemicals, that becomes a lot more expensive. Um, you know, I was living in Victoria, Canada, and we had a really cool project that was started by a really rad kind of mycologist, Danielle Stevenson, that was called, I think it was like Heal City Soils or something like that. I'll send you guys the resource, but they partnered with a university that was like offering all this free soil testing to folks who wanted to garden. And from that testing, they were creating a map of the community, of like, you could actually look at different points and be like, oh, my neighbor has like lead, maybe I have lead. And like it would show those results live. And so that's like, you know, one place was doing that. Different communities seem to do different things. But universities and extensions are good places. If there's any kind of local, kind of big urban farming, gardening organizations, they might also offer that, depending. When I've worked on different projects, like if you're doing a community project, reaching out to a local university can be a way to get free testing, like partnering with them can be really helpful. And then sometimes if I don't have that, I just reach out to all these different soil testing labs and try to write something really compelling and dramatic. And sometimes they offer you very cheap testing or half off. But it really depends if they're into what you're doing. So if it's a bigger community thing or involves something sexy like mushrooms, sometimes you can get some of the more corporate labs to help out. But that's a bit rare. So yeah, it really depends. And I don't know, maybe Morgan and I can put our heads together to get a bit of other options for the group.
So that is really great information. And Jan was asking, where do you acquire mycorrhizal fungi to inject?
Not to inject, more to inoculate. So with mycorrhizal fungi, you can get it, you can probably buy it online. You can get it at different garden stores. And then it comes kind of as like this like kind of powdery, you know, spores, and you would put it into water, make a slurry, and then you would dip your plant roots into that. Or you could kind of just sprinkle some of that into your compost, right? Or add it into your compost tea. So that is how you would do that. Again, there's certain mycologists who really are big on being like, make your own, like, because then it's more like kind of the place. But there's a lot of good ones you can get at local garden stores that are, you know, a good way to start for sure.
Very cool. Sylvia, I know you have your hand up if you want to say something. Or maybe no. No worries. Um, okay, I think that covered almost all the questions. Oh yeah, okay. And then you put in that your book was called Earth Repair.
Called Earth Repair.
Um,
And also thanks to Peg, because Peg put that for the soil testing, University of Delaware offers soil testing for $17. That includes lead. So that's amazing. One thing I'll quickly say on soil testing, when I first started doing this work, I was working on this herbal medicine garden called the People's Apothecary in Victoria. And it was this big medicine garden that we were going to plant all these great local herbs so people come and harvest their own medicine. And I was in charge of the soil testing, and I sent samples in to a lab and I said, can you test these? And they said, yup. And I paid $80 and they sent me back this beautiful thing that told me like, you know, my nitrogen, my potassium, my, you know, all the phosphorus, all this stuff. And I didn't see any metals on it. And I was like, oh, we have no metals. Good job. We're great. We can go ahead. And it was because I didn't ask for the right test. So if you are ever working with a lab, and this is my stupid thing, luckily we sheet most anyway. So we got to cover up my mistake. But if you are ever doing soil testing, you have to be really clear what you're asking. Like you say, like, I want the following metals or chemicals tested for. A really common metals test is called the CAM17. And it's like 17 of the kind of the bigger metals that you should be looking for. But even in, for example, like Baltimore, like if you could do a test that involves lead, arsenic, chromium, and cadmium, that would be a good start in terms of like some of those priority things. And then on chemicals, I always look for like PAHs, dioxin, if you've had any kind of fire or burning on site. Those are two things to really consider. And if you can't afford to test for those, just know that if there was like a fire on site, you know, or people were like, you know, people were doing work on cars and stuff like that, you just need to assume that you have those chemicals and then, you know, work with the right bacteria, fungi, cover crops, whatever, to kind of address it.
You so much for
Yeah.
all this amazing information. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but if anybody, I know we're getting, well, we're a minute past our time. So if you have a quick question you want to throw out there, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Last call. And
Okay.
I don't know if like Rise of Renewal, if you guys need volunteers, do you have any work parties coming up or anything where you want to publicize that?
I think we might be taking a break this year.
Ah,
Got
okay.
accepted into that program and
Okay.
make space. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Cool.
But
Okay.
thank you. Thank you for thinking up for that, the call out.
For sure. I love the work you do. So
Oh, well, thank you so much. This has been really, really fascinating. I learned so much. I think everybody else did. So much gratitude to you, Leila, for coming out and speaking with us. Yeah, I feel like this information is going to be remediative and moving through the mycorrhizal webs of our urban gardening network in the city. So yeah, thank you so much for the amazing work that you do. And yeah, and I will follow up to everybody. Oh wait, okay, there's one more question. Sorry, I see in the chat.
long question right at the end, Jan. Let's do it.
Cool. Do you see it? You want to read it or do you want me to?
Yes. Okay. So Jan asked, lead paint fell from a sand power washing station of a TV tower nearby. They're claiming that people's gardens won't get lead in their plants. Not true. It depends because it's like, again, how, so if how much lead fell, but it's this lead paint that fell, if it's in the soil, then it's going to be in the soil in terms of kind of contamination. If people are like raised beds, then that would be less of an issue. If that soil is like heavily mulched so that there isn't any splashback or lead dust that's getting onto the plants, that would reduce that. And also depending on like, what is the pH of your soil? Like, is it, if it's more acidic, then you would be more worried about lead getting into kind of the greens, for example, and into the roots of the plant. If it's more alkaline, maybe less worried. But yeah, it really depends on the amount. But I would be a bit worried if it kind of fell in a way that it's like present on the soil and it's not kind of covered up and it hasn't, you know, been dealt with. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I'm sorry that happened. Yeah, it was everywhere. That is not ideal. So I would, I don't know who said it won't get into people's plants, but it's, I think there's also a bit of like, they might be playing on the fact that like, it might not get pulled up into the plant because lead is clunky, right? But again, if it's everywhere and it's on the soil, then it eventually becomes kind of this like leaded soil dust. And when there's wind, when there's raindrops, that gets onto the surface of plants, it's going to coat the roots or like the, you know, beets and carrots and stuff like that. So I would be worried, and I would take kind of mitigation, remediation actions. I wouldn't believe them. And it sounds like you don't believe them. They hired corporate defenders. So no, I would not believe that. I'm happy it was the corporation and not the government saying that. I will say just finally, if folks want to get in touch with me, I have a website, and you can reach out to me through my website. If you have a project, or you're like, wow, I still have a major question or something like that. I put it in the chat. Oh, I should actually do the www. Hold on. It's earthrepair.ca because it's in Canada. So if you put .com, you're not going to get me. But if you put .ca, you can contact me that way. And yeah, I really appreciate everybody asking such great questions and listening. So I hope this helps you in your work.
Thank you so much, Leila. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming, and be following up with the recording and more resources soon. And yeah, have a great night, and thanks again.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Leila.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Great job.